You think you know the Iron Maiden? That spiked coffin of nightmares where victims were locked inside, pierced from all sides until they bled out slowly. Hollywood loves it. Tourists gawk at it in museums. It's the poster child of medieval cruelty. But here's the disturbing truth. The Iron Maiden, as you imagine it, was a lie, a 19th century invention, built from medieval parts to terrify modern audiences. Which raises a terrifying question. If the Iron Maiden wasn't real, what were the actual tortures medieval people used? Spoiler, they were far worse than a fake coffin with spikes. Let's rewind to Nuremberg, 1515. A chronicler describes the execution of a coin forger in an Iron Maiden. But dig deeper, and you'll realize he was embellishing using older words for torture chest and splicing it with ancient punishments. When 19th century museum curators pieced together an authentic Iron Maiden from random armor parts and spiked doors, they didn't just create a creepy prop, they created the world's most successful medieval hoax. But here's the kicker. They didn't need the Iron Maiden to shock anyone, because the real punishments of the Middle Ages made the fake look merciful. Take the breaking wheel. Imagine being tied spread eagle across a massive cartwheel. The executioner takes an iron bar and smashes your limbs one by one, arms, legs, shoulders, until your bones resemble shattered glass. Then your mangled body is woven through the spokes and hoisted high for crows to finish off. Survivors sometimes lived for days in that state. Tourists today stare at empty Iron Maidens. Real medieval villagers stared at neighbors rotting on wheels by the roadside. Or consider boiling alive, a punishment officially sanctioned in England under Henry VIII. Convicted poisoners were dunked into vats of oil, pitch, or water heated from below. Their skin blistered, split, and sloughed off while crowds watched the flesh cook from bone. One chronicler in 1542 described the screams echoing like the damned in hell. Compared to that, the Iron Maiden looks like a toy. And then there's the Judas cradle, an execution device as obscene as it was cruel. Picture a pyramid-shaped wooden spike. The victim is stripped naked, hoisted by ropes, and slowly lowered onto the point which pierced the body cavity. Every movement, every breath, made it worse. Some victims were left for hours, some for days. Infection, agony, and humiliation did the killing. This was real, this was documented, and unlike the Iron Maiden, it left corpses behind. So why invent a fake torture when reality was already brutal enough? Simple. Spectacle sells. The 1800s loved shocking displays of medieval barbarity to contrast with their so-called modern enlightenment. Museums needed gruesome props. The Iron Maiden became a perfect myth, terrifying, photogenic, and marketable. By the time historians called it out as fraud, it was too late. Pop culture had already crowned it queen of medieval torture. The truly disturbing part? We've spent 200 years obsessing over a fake coffin while ignoring the real nightmares people endured. Villagers saw loved ones boiled like stew. Criminals screamed as bones cracked on wheels. Women accused of witchcraft drowned on dunking stools. And none of these need Hollywood embellishment because they actually happened. So next time you see an Iron Maiden in a museum, remember, it's a stage prop, a lie built from rusty armor and morbid imagination. But don't get comfortable, because the real Middle Ages didn't need a spiked coffin. They had wheels, flames, boiling pots, and wooden pyramids. And they used them over and over for centuries. Which makes you wonder, why do we cling to the Iron Maiden myth? Maybe because the truth is harder to face. Myths can be closed in glass cases. Real torture lived in the open air of marketplaces, in the screams that echoed over cobblestones, in the bones left for crows. That's medieval cruelty for you. More real, more brutal, and infinitely worse than a fake box of spikes. You think execution by fire was the worst fate in the Middle Ages? Think again. Burning alive at the stake was horrific, but at least it was quick, once the flames caught. Now, imagine a punishment where you weren't burned by fire, but cooked slowly, screaming as your flesh blistered and your organs boiled like meat in a stew. This wasn't legend, this was law. For centuries, Europe and Asia sentenced criminals to death by boiling alive. And trust me, it was every bit as horrific as it sounds. The punishment wasn't invented by sadistic dungeon keepers, it was written into official law codes. Under King Henry VIII of England, poisoners were boiled in vats of water, pitch, or oil. Chroniclers recorded the screams carrying for blocks. In 1531, a cook named Richard Roos was accused of poisoning porridge served to a bishop. His punishment? A giant cauldron set up in Smithfield Market. Witnesses wrote that his flesh burst in divers places as Londoners watched him thrash and scream until death. But England wasn't unique. Across Europe, boiling alive was considered a just punishment for certain crimes. In the Holy Roman Empire, counterfeiters were boiled for corrupting the currency. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible ordered traitors boiled in enormous vats of tar. And in Asia, the Mongols and Chinese used massive cauldrons of water or oil, sometimes lowering victims in gradually so the crowd could enjoy every stage of their suffering. The method was simple and sadistic. The condemned were stripped, bound, and hoisted above a massive iron cauldron. Sometimes they were plunged in all at once. Other times they were lowered slowly, feet first, prolonging agony as skin blistered, split, and peeled away. Chroniclers describe victims shrieking as fat melted off their bodies and floated on the surface. The smell, burning hair, cooking flesh, boiling blood turned marketplaces into hellscapes. And here's the really twisted part. Sometimes authorities reused the same cauldron for multiple executions. After one criminal died, another was dropped in, their bodies sharing the same horrific broth. Eyewitnesses wrote of townsfolk fainting, vomiting, even cheering as bodies cooked like stew. Why boiling? Symbolism. Poisoners boiled in water because they had poisoned food. Counterfeiters boiled in oil because they had corrupted commerce. The punishment was theatrical, a moral lesson written on the human body in the most brutal way possible. So next time you sip a hot soup, imagine the cauldron not in a kitchen, but in a town square filled with screams. The Iron Maiden may be a myth, but boiling alive was brutally real. Kings, tsars, emperors all sanctioned it. And millions of ordinary citizens watched. You've been told the Middle Ages were brutal. What they didn't tell you is that entire cities gathered to watch their neighbors cooked alive. You've seen rats as pests, dirty rodents scurrying through alleys. But in medieval dungeons, rats weren't just vermin, they were weapons. Executioners turned these animals into instruments of slow, unimaginable suffering. And the worst part? The rats did all the work themselves. Rat torture appeared across Europe from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance. The setup was simple, but the horror was legendary. The victim was stripped, bound, and placed on their back. A cage containing starved rats was strapped to their stomach or chest. The bottom of the cage was removed, leaving only the thin layer of flesh between rats and freedom. Then came the cruelty. Executioners applied heat to the top of the cage, desperate to escape the burning metal. The rats did the only thing they could. They burrowed straight into living flesh. Eyewitness accounts from the Dutch revolt describe rebels captured by Spanish forces subjected to this exact torment. Rats chewed through skin, muscle, even into intestines, driven mad by hunger and heat. Victims shrieked as their insides became tunnels for desperate animals. But this wasn't just Spain. In France, rats were weaponized in prison cells, starving animals released into confined spaces where chained prisoners had no defense. Rats gnawed at toes, ears, and soft flesh, while victims lay helpless. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible's secret police reportedly used similar methods, unleashing swarms of rats into confined pits until prisoners begged for death. The genius, if you can call it that, of rat torture was its efficiency. The executioner didn't need to swing an axe or light a pyre. The animal did everything. Rats became living blades, cutting through human flesh with gnashing teeth. And because it was natural, authorities could claim the death was caused not by torture, but by vermin. Legal loophole, medieval style. The next time you see a rat in the subway, remember, it's not just a pest. In medieval dungeons, rats were living torture devices, gnawing through flesh and organs, while crowds listened to the screams. Forget myths like the Iron Maiden. Rat torture was real, and it turned hunger into horror. Imagine your bones shattered one by one, your body bent into impossible shapes, and your mangled corpse left for birds to devour. That wasn't fantasy. That was the breaking wheel, Europe's most iconic tool of destruction, also called the Catherine wheel. This punishment was the pride of medieval executioners. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel. Their arms and legs were stretched across the spokes. Then came the hammer. The executioner smashed each limb with an iron bar, splintering bones like kindling. The goal wasn't instant death. It was transformation, turning a human body into a twisted puzzle of broken parts. Once every limb was crushed, the shattered body was woven through the wheel's spokes, threaded like rope. Then the wheel was raised upright and displayed in public. Birds picked at eyes, dogs gnawed on dangling flesh. Survivors, yes. Some lived screamed for days before finally dying of shock, thirst, or infection. One German executioner's manual gave chilling instructions. Strike at joints, avoid vital organs, prolong the agony. Sometimes mercy blows to the chest ended it quickly. Other times, there was no mercy. Records from 16th century France describe criminals lasting 3 days on display, moaning through broken jaws as peasants walked past. The breaking wheel wasn't just execution, it was theatre. Markets filled with spectators, vendors sold food, families brought children to watch. It was a medieval festival of suffering, and when the body finally rotted away, the wheel itself became a symbol of justice, standing tall on the roadside as a warning. The Iron Maiden may have been fake, but the breaking wheel was horrifyingly real. It turned men into mangled sculptures of bone and flesh, decorating highways with human misery. Next time you pass a carnival Ferris wheel, remember its ancestor was built not for joy, but for agony. The Vikings are remembered as raiders, explorers, and warriors. But nothing defines their cruelty more than the legendary blood eagle, a ritual execution so savage it still shocks historians. The question is, was it real or just medieval propaganda? According to Norse sagas, the blood eagle was reserved for traitors or captured kings. The victim was laid face down, a sharp axe sliced through the back, splitting ribs from the spine. Executioners pulled the ribs outward like wings. The lungs were yanked through the openings, spread across the back as grotesque feathers. The victim, if still alive, suffocated slowly as their own lungs filled with blood. Sounds insane, right? Almost too horrific to be true. That's the debate. Some historians argue it was real ritualized torture designed to terrify enemies. Archaeological finds of rib cages split in strange ways suggest the possibility. Others think it was literary exaggeration, a poetic metaphor for slaughter, later misread as literal. But whether fact or propaganda, the effect was the same. Medieval writers used the blood eagle as shorthand for Viking savagery. One saga describes King Ella of Northumbria suffering the ritual in 867 AD, his back split open while Norsemen sang songs of victory. True or not, the image was unforgettable. The psychological power was enormous. If enemies believed Vikings could carve lungs into wings, fear alone could paralyze resistance, and maybe that was the point. Cruelty doesn't always need to be real to be effective. Sometimes the story is enough. So was the blood eagle fact or fiction? The truth may never be known, but in a way, it doesn't matter. For medieval people, belief in the ritual was real enough. Fear became its own weapon, carving nightmares into Europe's imagination. The Vikings didn't need Iron Maidens. They had stories, and sometimes stories cut deeper than blades. You think prison means a cell, a bed, and maybe some bread and water. Not in medieval Europe. In parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, punishment didn't mean imprisonment. It meant slow-motion death in a starvation tower, a stone silo where you weren't just forgotten, you were erased. No trial, no executioner's axe. Just hunger, thirst, and silence swallowing you until nothing remained. These towers, sometimes called hunger terms, still stand today as tourist attractions, harmless stone ruins with pretty ivy climbing their walls. But inside, they were hell. Prisoners were lowered into windowless chambers with no furniture, no bedding, no light. Sometimes there was a small hole for air, food, and water. That depended on the mood of the jailer. In many cases, nothing was ever lowered down. The punishment was simple: starve. Chroniclers from 14th century Germany describe noble families locking unwanted heirs or rebellious peasants into these towers. The walls were thick. The outside world couldn't hear the screams. Inside, prisoners clawed at the stone until their fingernails tore off. Archaeologists have found gouges in the walls, desperate marks from those who tried to climb their way out. None ever did. The psychological torture was worse than the hunger. Imagine being thrown into a pitch-black hole, the door sealing above you. At first, you shout for help. Hours pass, days pass. Your throat cracks from thirst. Rats scuttle in the dark, feeding on scraps and eventually on you. Records show some prisoners went mad within days, gnawing at their own flesh in desperation. One case from 1463 describes a nobleman accused of treason in Württemberg. Instead of execution, he was dropped into a hunger tower with his wife. The townspeople reported no sound after the third day. Months later, when the tower was opened, only bones remained, gnawed clean. But starvation towers weren't just for traitors. They were sometimes used for entire families. In the German town of Göttingen, an entire clan accused of witchcraft was lowered into a tower, parents and children together. No food was provided. When the door was opened a year later, archaeologists believed the survivors had eaten the dead. Why towers? Symbolism. They were visible from the town square. Every villager knew, resist, and you'd vanish into the walls. No blood, no spectacle, just silence. It was cruelty disguised as efficiency. So the next time you see a medieval tower on a postcard, remember, it may not have been a castle. It may have been a tomb where men, women, and even children starved in darkness while their screams echoed unheard. The Iron Maiden is a myth. The Hunger Tower was real, and it killed slower than any spike ever could. Imagine being forced to ride a horse made of sharp wood, naked, with weights tied to your ankles. This wasn't some carnival trick. It was the Spanish donkey, a torture device so simple and so cruel that victims often begged to be executed instead. The Spanish donkey looked harmless at first glance, just a wooden beam, sharpened at the top into a wedge, like an inverted V. Victims were stripped and forced to sit astride it, their full weight pressing down on the razor-thin edge. Pain was immediate, flesh split, blood flowed, and this was only the beginning. Executioners made it worse by tying heavy stones to the victim's ankles, dragging them down further. The sharp beam cut deeper into the thighs, the groin, even the pelvis. Chroniclers report some victims split entirely in half after hours of agony. This wasn't a fringe punishment. Records from the Spanish Inquisition mention its use against heretics. French revolutionaries later revived it as a humiliation for traitors. Soldiers in Napoleonic armies even joked about riding the wooden horse as a disciplinary punishment, except no one laughed when the blood began to drip. The cruelty was psychological too. Victims were paraded in public squares, seated on the donkey while townsfolk jeered, children laughed, women spat. The condemned man screamed as the wedge tore into his body, often fainting, then revived with cold water so the torment could continue. One eyewitness in Barcelona described a heretic punished this way in 1620. He sat as if upon the blade of a sword. The flesh opened like parchment. His shrieks carried across the square. The inquisitors sat in silence, nodding as though justice was done. Why this device? Because it turned humiliation into agony. It mocked masculinity, stripping men naked, splitting them in the groin, turning virility into vulnerability. It was torture tailored to destroy body and pride. So when you hear the name Spanish donkey, don't picture a harmless beast of burden. Picture a sharpened beam splitting flesh and bone, a crowd watching as a man is slowly sawn apart without a blade. That was justice, medieval style. We think of witch burnings as solemn, tragic events, but in the Middle Ages, they weren't just executions, they were festivals. Entire towns turned out. Merchants sold snacks, priests preached sermons, parents brought children to watch. Burning women alive wasn't just punishment. It was entertainment. From the 15th to the 17th century, tens of thousands of people across Europe were accused of witchcraft. Most were women. Their crimes? Owning cats, mixing herbs, being widowed, or simply being disliked by neighbors. Once accused, the outcome was almost certain: fire. But these weren't secret executions, they were public spectacles. Town criers announced the burnings days in advance. Vendors set up stalls selling bread, ale, and sweets. People traveled from neighboring villages to watch the flames. It was a medieval carnival, except the main attraction was a screaming woman tied to a stake. Eyewitness accounts describe the horror. In Würzburg, Germany, 1,629, 157 women and children were burned in a single year. One record says, "The market was full. The crowd sang psalms as the flames rose. The smell was like roasted meat. Children clapped as accused witches writhed in agony." But it wasn't just burning. Before execution, women were often tortured for confessions. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, the strappado dislocated shoulders. Confessions extracted this way were read aloud before the crowd, proof that justice was being done. Then came the fire. Sometimes dry wood was used, burning fast. Other times, wet logs and green branches were stacked deliberately, ensuring slow suffocation in thick smoke before flames reached the flesh. Victims often died from carbon monoxide, choking while the crowd jeered. The church cloaked this in morality. Priests preached that the flames purified the soul, but the reality was darker. Burning witches became a form of social control, uniting communities against an enemy that didn't exist and distracting them from poverty, war, and corruption. So the next time you imagine a witch burning, don't see it as a grim necessity of the past. See it as a medieval circus, crowds cheering, vendors selling bread, children clapping, while women burned alive. Entertainment, paid for in screams. If you think medieval torture was about whips and chains, let me introduce you to the pair of anguish, a device that turned the human body itself into a torture chamber. Inserted into the mouth, the anus, or the vagina, it expanded until flesh tore. It wasn't just pain, it was humiliation, weaponized. The pair of anguish was a metal device, shaped like a fruit, divided into segments with a screw mechanism, inserted while closed. It seemed harmless. But with every twist of the screw, the petals opened wider, stretching flesh until it ripped apart. Victims accused of blasphemy had it forced into their mouths. Women accused of witchcraft or adultery had it inserted vaginally. Homosexual men faced it rectally. It wasn't just torture, it was a statement: your body is no longer yours. No two devices were alike. Some were simple, others had spikes that tore as they expanded. One 17th-century record from France describes a prostitute gagged with the pair until her jaw dislocated. Another German case mentions a man accused of sodomy dying after his intestines ruptured from rectal insertion. The cruelty was psychological as much as physical. Victims often confessed instantly, not because of the pain alone, but because of the humiliation. Entire crowds watched as priests and officials used the device to degrade the condemned in ways they would never describe in public records. And here's the kicker. Some modern historians argue that many surviving pairs are fakes, like the Iron Maiden 19th-century inventions, to shock tourists. But trial records and confessions describe devices that worked exactly this way. Whether all were real or not, the suffering they represented was undeniable. So when you hear of the pair of anguish, don't dismiss it as a myth. Whether artifact or symbol, the fact remains. Medieval justice, weaponized humiliation, turning private parts into public torture. Sometimes the pain wasn't just physical, it was the agony of being destroyed from the inside out. In Europe, they used wheels, racks, and fire. But in medieval India, execution had a different face, the face of an elephant. Forget war elephants on the battlefield. These beasts were executioners, trained to crush, dismember, or even torture humans with terrifying precision. For centuries, elephants were not just symbols of power in South and Southeast Asia, they were tools of justice. Mughal emperors and Indian kings trained elephants to execute criminals. A royal order could mean instant death beneath a massive foot or hours of torment. One chronicler in 14th-century Delhi described elephants equipped with sharpened blades on their tusks, used to slice criminals into pieces. Others were trained to throw victims into the air before trampling them. The power was terrifying. A single step could shatter a man's spine. But it wasn't always instant. Records from the Mughal court reveal elephants trained for slow executions. They pushed victims with their trunks, breaking bones but not killing outright. Executioners commanded them to prolong suffering, crushing one limb at a time. Crowds gathered, gasping at each crack of bone. European visitors were horrified. François Bernier, a French traveller in the 1600s, wrote of elephants trampling thieves in the royal square. Sometimes they were ordered to drag victims through streets before the final crushing blow. Justice wasn't just done, it was displayed. Why elephants? Symbolism. They embodied the king's absolute power, massive, unstoppable, godlike. To die beneath an elephant wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda, a living demonstration of the ruler's might. The practice spread beyond India. In Siam, elephants hurled condemned men into the air before impaling them. In Persia, they crushed bodies slowly, prolonging screams. Even the Romans borrowed the method in North Africa, using elephants to trample prisoners before cheering crowds. So forget guillotines and gallows. In parts of the medieval world, justice came with tusks and trunks. The executioner wasn't a man with an axe, it was a beast weighing 6 tons, obeying a single command: crush. The Iron Maiden may be myth, but elephants as executioners? That was a nightmare no man could survive. Forget the guillotine, forget the gallows. In medieval England, the ultimate punishment was far worse, being drawn and quartered. It was the crown's way of saying, "You betrayed us, now we will erase you." It wasn't just an execution, it was a public dissection of body, spirit, and honor. The sentence was reserved for traitors. First, the condemned was drawn, tied to a horse, and dragged through the filth of the city streets, their body bouncing off cobblestones, faces torn by stones, covered in mud and waste. It was a humiliation designed to break not just the flesh, but the dignity of the accused. Then came the hanging. The victim was strung up by the neck, but not long enough to die, just enough to choke, convulse, and lose control of their body before being cut down, gasping for air, eyes bulging in terror. Next, disembowelment. Executioners sliced open the abdomen, pulling intestines out while the victim still breathed. Chroniclers describe men screaming until their lungs collapsed. Their genitals were cut off and thrown into flames as a symbol of dishonor. Finally came the quartering. The body was hacked into 4 pieces, limbs separated from torso. The head was chopped off, dipped in tar, and mounted on London Bridge as a warning. The arms and legs were shipped to other towns, displayed on city gates to remind everyone, betrayal ends with mutilation. This wasn't a quick execution. Records show men lasting through each stage, sometimes begging for death. In 1305, William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, made famous by Braveheart, suffered this exact fate. Witnesses say he endured the dragging, partial hanging, and mutilation before his body was finally quartered. His head crowned London Bridge for years. It wasn't only rebels. Even ordinary men accused of treason could be subjected to this horror. The punishment was so legendary that crowds gathered to watch, selling food and drink like it was theatre. Children stood on shoulders to see entrails pulled from living bodies. The crowd didn't weep, they cheered. Drawn and quartered wasn't just death, it was obliteration. The body destroyed, the memory disgraced, the pieces scattered. The Iron Maiden is a myth, but England's ultimate punishment was horrifyingly real. And it wasn't just about killing traitors. It was about making sure no one ever forgot what happened to them. Medieval dungeons weren't rows of cells with iron bars. The most feared prison wasn't a room at all. It was a hole. The French called it an oubliette, from oublier, to forget. Once you were dropped inside, you weren't meant to come out. The oubliette was a vertical shaft dug into castle floors or carved into rock. Prisoners were lowered by ropes or thrown down. There were no windows, no doors, no beds, just damp stone, crawling insects, and darkness. Sometimes the shaft was narrow enough you couldn't even sit down. Food and water were rarely given. Many were simply abandoned to starve. Rats fed on the living and the dead. In some castles, archaeologists have found piles of bones at the bottom, skulls stacked on top of each other, proof of decades of forgotten prisoners. For those kept alive, the torture was psychological. Imagine days without light, the air damp and cold, the silence broken only by scratching vermin. You don't know if it's been hours or weeks. Time dissolves. Mind and body rot together. The oubliette wasn't just for common thieves. Nobles accused of betrayal were locked inside too, stripped of their titles and forgotten like trash. In the Château de Vincennes in France, prisoners left carved messages into the walls, desperate scratches of names, prayers, and madness. The worst was when oubliettes doubled as cesspits. Prisoners drowned not in water but in excrement, choking as filth filled their lungs. Chroniclers describe nobles ordering enemies thrown into the latrine, and that wasn't a metaphor. The oubliette wasn't execution, it was deletion. No body to bury, no grave to mark, just bones lost in a hole, memories erased. The cruelest punishment isn't always the sword. Sometimes it's being buried alive in darkness, waiting to be forgotten. In medieval Europe, women could be punished not just for crimes, but for words. If you were a nag, a gossip, or simply spoke too much, there was a device waiting, the scold's bridle, also called the brank, an iron mask designed not to hide the face, but to humiliate and silence it. The bridle was a cage of iron strapped around the head, clamping the jaw shut. At the front, a flat piece of metal, sometimes spiked, was forced into the mouth. It pressed against the tongue, making speech impossible. Any attempt to talk caused pain. The punishment was public. Women were paraded through town squares wearing the bridle, while crowds jeered. Husbands, priests, and magistrates watched proudly as justice was done. The humiliation was the point. Silence wasn't enough. They had to be seen being silenced. Some bridles had bells attached, jingling as the woman stumbled through the streets, drawing more attention. Others had grotesque masks shaped like animals or demons, turning the victim into a public spectacle. But the pain was real too. Metal tore into the tongue, teeth cracked, blood filled the mouth. Some women choked on their own blood, others developed infections that killed them long after the punishment ended. It wasn't rare. Records across Scotland, England, and Germany show hundreds of women punished this way for scolding or loose tongues. In reality, it was often used to silence wives who argued, widows who spoke out, or women who embarrassed powerful men. The scold's bridle was more than a gag, it was a weapon of control. It turned a woman's voice into a crime, her silence into entertainment, and her pain into policy. In an age where cruelty was common, even words could get you tortured. The Romans invented it. The medievals revived it. One of the strangest, most horrifying executions in history, poena culae, the punishment of the sack. You weren't just killed. You were sewn into a bag with live animals and drowned. This punishment was for parricides, those who killed their parents. The crime was so unnatural, the punishment had to be monstrous. The condemned was stripped, flogged, and then sewn into a large leather sack. But he wasn't alone. Inside the sack were animals, a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. The symbolism was brutal. The dog for loyalty betrayed, the snake for treachery, the rooster for awakening the dead, the monkey for mockery. Together, they created chaos in the sack. As the sack was carried to water, the animals panicked. The dog snapped, the snake bit, the monkey clawed, the rooster shrieked. Victims were mauled even before drowning. Then the sack was thrown into a river or sea, sinking with screams inside. Medieval chronicles record its use in Germany and Italy. One case in the 13th century describes a parricide drowned in the Rhine this way. In some variations, if animals weren't available, substitutes were used: cats, geese, or pigs. The cruelty wasn't just in death, but in symbolism. You weren't treated as human anymore. You were an abomination, buried not in soil but in water. Your body denied the dignity of a grave. Poena culae wasn't mass torture. It was rare, and that's what made it terrifying. A punishment so bizarre it spread like legend. Imagine your last moments, trapped in a writhing sack of claws, fangs, feathers, and screams, sinking into darkness. That was medieval justice for the unforgivable. Some medieval tortures weren't about blood or fire. Some were simpler, designed to make the victim suffer every second they stayed alive. Enter the heretic's fork, a small device that turned the act of holding your head into torture. The fork was a metal rod with two prongs on each end. It was strapped between the chin and the chest, or between the throat and the sternum and the underside of the jaw. Leather straps kept it in place. The victim couldn't lower their head without stabbing themselves. It sounds small, but the pain was constant. Victims couldn't sleep, their head would drop, and the spikes would stab. They couldn't speak or pray. Every nod, every moment of fatigue meant blood. The fork was used against suspected heretics, witches, or blasphemers. Victims were forced to wear it during interrogations or paraded through towns. Some were strapped for days, collapsing from exhaustion but jolted awake by stabbing metal. One 16th century inquisitor's manual described the fork as an instrument to keep the mind vigilant. Translation: it prevented sleep until confessions came. Victims begged for mercy, not because of broken bones, but because their own body betrayed them with every blink. It was small enough to be hidden under cloaks, turning public humiliation into a secret torment. Some prisoners died not from the fork itself, but from infection, dehydration, or madness after days without rest. The heretic's fork proves medieval cruelty wasn't always grand or bloody. Sometimes it was subtle, a simple rod of iron that turned sleep, speech, and life itself into torture, because in a world obsessed with punishment, even your own head wasn't safe. In a world ruled by kings and emperors, power often depended on who you trusted in your palace. And for centuries, rulers decided the safest servants were men, stripped of manhood, eunuchs. But this wasn't just a punishment, it was an industry. Across Byzantium, the Islamic world, and parts of medieval Europe, castration was business. Bloody, cruel, and permanent. Castration wasn't always symbolic. It was surgical, if you can call it that. Boys, sometimes prisoners of war, sometimes slaves bought from parents, were mutilated before puberty. Knives sliced off testicles, sometimes the penis as well. The lucky ones had a partial procedure and survived. Many bled to death. The Byzantine Empire relied heavily on eunuchs. They guarded harems, ran treasuries, and served as advisors. Why? Because without families or heirs, they were seen as loyal to the emperor alone. But loyalty was bought at the cost of childhood. Travelers in the 10th century described eunuch factories in the Caucasus and along the Mediterranean trade routes. Boys were captured, castrated in filthy conditions, then sold for enormous profit. Mortality rates were brutal. One Arab writer claimed only 1 in 10 survived. Those who did lived lives of prestige in courts, but always as half-men, marked forever by screams they made as children. Castration was also punishment. Thieves, rapists, even political rivals were mutilated to strip them of dignity. In France, records describe rebellious peasants castrated publicly, their severed parts nailed to town gates as warnings. The cruelty wasn't just physical, it was social. Eunuchs were mocked, despised, and yet indispensable. They lived between worlds, not quite men, not quite women, forever defined by violence inflicted upon them. Eunuchs remind us that cruelty isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about reshaping the living, carving loyalty from flesh, and turning bodies into tools of empire. The Iron Maiden never existed. But the knife that made eunuchs was all too real, and it left scars not just on bodies, but on civilizations. Not every medieval punishment ended in death. Sometimes the cruelty was humiliation, slow, grinding, psychological torment. One of the strangest? The wheelbarrow of shame. A punishment where criminals were forced to carry their own disgrace through the streets, one heavy load at a time. Across Europe, especially in Germany and the Low Countries, petty criminals, thieves, debtors, adulterers could be sentenced to shame punishments. The wheelbarrow was a favorite. Offenders were forced to push massive loads of stones or dung through the marketplace, often naked or in rags. Crowds gathered not to sympathize, but to laugh, spit, and throw rotten food. The condemned stumbled, straining under the load while jeers rang out. Women shouted insults. Children pelted them with mud. The punishment could last hours, even days. Some cities forced repeat offenders to push wheelbarrows every week as a ritual reminder of their disgrace. Chroniclers in Cologne describe women convicted of adultery forced to haul manure through the streets while husbands watched smugly. The cruelty wasn't in broken bones, it was in broken pride. Merchants, priests, neighbors, everyone saw your shame. The wheelbarrow became a mobile stage, your humiliation the play, and sometimes it did kill. In hot summers, the weight, exhaustion, and dehydration finished what the crowd started. Bodies collapsed in filth while people laughed. The wheelbarrow of shame proves medieval cruelty wasn't always about spikes and flames. Sometimes it was about weight, the weight of stones, of dung, of ridicule. Because in an age obsessed with order, humiliation itself was a form of death. When we imagine burning at the stake, we think of fire, instantly engulfing a victim, flesh melting, screams swallowed by flame. But the truth was slower, uglier. Most people didn't die from fire. They died from smoke choking before the flames ever reached their skin. Burning was the go-to punishment for heresy, witchcraft, and treason. The condemned was tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by bundles of kindling. Sometimes dry wood was used for a quick burn. But often, deliberately, green wood and wet logs were stacked. They created thick, choking smoke before fire. Eyewitnesses described victims coughing violently, their lungs filling with black clouds, their bodies convulsing as air turned to poison. Death could take minutes or hours. Only when the flames finally rose high did the body ignite, skin blistering, hair burning away. In some cases, executioners showed mercy, strangulation with a rope before the fire was lit. But not always. Joan of Arc, burned in Rouen in 1431, reportedly screamed prayers until thick smoke silenced her. Her body, charred and broken, was burned twice more to ensure no relic survived. The spectacle was massive. Thousands gathered. Priests preached sermons. Vendors sold ale and bread. The condemned person's body became both theatre and warning. And the cruelty didn't stop at death. Ashes were scattered in rivers, ensuring no burial, no memory, no martyr's shrine. Burning at the stake wasn't just fire. It was smoke, suffocation, humiliation, and erasure. The myth is dramatic flames. The truth is lungs filled with poison, hours of coughing screams, and a crowd cheering as you suffocated. When you hear Vlad the Impaler, you picture Dracula, but the reality was far more terrifying. Impalement wasn't legend, it was real, and it was one of the most agonizing deaths ever devised. Impalement meant exactly what it sounds like, driving a sharp stake through the body. But it wasn't quick. Executioners sharpened stakes to a fine point, greased them, and inserted them slowly, sometimes through the anus, sometimes through the stomach. The goal wasn't to pierce vital organs immediately, but to let the body slide down gradually. Victims could live for hours, even days, writhing as the stake tore through intestines, lungs, or chest. Chroniclers of Vlad III of Wallachia describe forests of corpses impaled along roads, some still moaning days later, crows feeding on their eyes. The horror was psychological too. Whole armies fled at the sight of fields covered with thousands of stakes, bodies twitching like grotesque scarecrows. When Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia in 1462, he retreated after seeing 20 corpses impaled, a wall of death engineered by Vlad himself. But impalement wasn't unique to Vlad. The Ottomans used it, the Persians used it, even medieval Germans recorded rare cases. It was universal cruelty, perfected by one man's reputation. Impalement was more than execution. It was theatre of terror, a performance meant to paralyze enemies with fear. And in the Middle Ages, fear was more powerful than swords. Dracula is myth. Vlad the Impaler's forests of corpses were fact. When you hear Catherine Wheel, maybe you think of fireworks spinning in the night sky. But the name comes from something far darker, the breaking wheel, associated with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a saint who was supposed to die on the wheel, but instead became its legend. The breaking wheel we already know, bones smashed, bodies woven through spokes. But in Christian legend, Catherine of Alexandria, a 4th century martyr, was sentenced to die on such a wheel for refusing to renounce her faith. The story goes the wheel shattered at her touch, killing executioners instead. The irony? Catherine became a symbol of resilience, her wheel turning into an emblem of faith. But for thousands who faced it in reality, the wheel didn't shatter. It mangled. The wheel's link to Catherine made the cruelty sharper. Executioners across Europe called it Catherine's wheel, blending piety with horror. Victims weren't saints. They were criminals, rebels, peasants. They didn't break the wheel broke them. Fireworks took the name, later spinning sparks meant to honor the saint, but the original sparks were bone fragments, blood spraying across cobblestones, screams echoing as crowds watched. The Catherine wheel reminds us how cruelty and faith intertwined. A saint's miracle became a murderer's tool, twisting bodies into broken shapes. And while fireworks today sparkle with joy, their name hides a legacy written in screams. Not every medieval execution was blood and spectacle. Some were quiet, efficient, and suffocating, literally. The garrotet turned strangulation into state policy, a chair, a collar, and a crank that choked the life out of criminals, rebels, and even kings. The garrote was deceptively simple. The condemned sat in a sturdy chair with a metal collar around their neck. Behind them, a screw or lever was turned slowly, tightening the collar until breathing became impossible. Sometimes a sharp spike pressed into the spine, snapping vertebrae. Other times it was just pressure, slow, crushing, suffocating. Unlike burning or quartering, the garrote was considered humane in Spain, Portugal, and much of Europe. Why? Because it left the body mostly intact. No blood sprayed across markets, no heads rolled. But make no mistake, it was agony. Victims thrashed, their eyes bulged, their tongues swelled as oxygen vanished. The Spanish Inquisition used it as a merciful alternative for heretics. Instead of burning alive, they were strangled first, then burned dead. Records describe nobles who bribed officials for the garrote instead of the flames. But it wasn't always clean. In 1820, Spain executed Rafael del Riego, a revolutionary general, by garrote. Witnesses wrote that the screw turned slowly, cracking bones, while his face purpled and lips foamed. The merciful machine took minutes to kill. Even kings weren't safe. In 1823, King Ferdinand VII ordered hundreds strangled by garrote during purges. By the 19th century, it became Spain's official execution method, a tool of bureaucracy, cold and silent. The garrote shows cruelty doesn't always scream. Sometimes it suffocates quietly, one turn of a screw at a time, until life is crushed. Less dramatic than fire, less bloody than the axe, but no less terrifying. Some torture devices were massive. Wheels, racks, and scaffolds filled squares. But some fit in your pocket. Enter the thumbscrew, a device so small, so simple, yet so devastating, it turned fingers into pulp and pain into confessions. The thumbscrew was a small vise with 2 or 3 metal bars. Victims placed their fingers inside. A screw tightened the bars together, crushing flesh and bone. With every turn, pain shot through nerves, fingers flattened, nails split. Bones snapped. It wasn't just thumbs. The device could be used on toes, ears, even genitals. Anything small enough to fit could be crushed. Interrogators loved it. Unlike racks or wheels, it was quick, cheap, and portable. Soldiers carried them in saddlebags. Inquisitors kept them in pockets. A confession was never far away. One Scottish record from the 17th century describes women accused of witchcraft confessing instantly after one squeeze of the thumbscrew. Another German account mentions victims fainting after their fingers burst, blood dripping onto floors. But the cruelty didn't end with confessions. Crushed fingers healed crooked, leaving permanent reminders of pain. Victims couldn't work, write, or even feed themselves properly. The thumbscrew was proof you didn't need grand devices to be cruel. Just a screw, some metal, and patience. Pain compressed into something small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Punishment isn't always about killing. Sometimes it's about marking. Across medieval and early modern worlds, criminals and slaves were branded like cattle. Red-hot irons seared symbols into skin, permanent reminders of shame, ownership, and cruelty. Branding was widespread. Thieves had T burned into cheeks. Runaway slaves had letters seared into foreheads. In France, the fleur-de-lis marked repeat offenders. In England, vagabonds were branded with V. The process was excruciating. An iron, heated until glowing red, was pressed against flesh. Skin hissed, smoke rose. The smell of burning meat filled the air. Victims screamed as nerves fried. The wound blistered, festered, and scarred. But the real cruelty wasn't the moment of pain. It was permanence. You couldn't escape the mark. It followed you into every marketplace, every church, every negotiation. You weren't a man or woman anymore. You were a branded body. Slaves suffered worst. In the Ottoman Empire, African slaves were branded on faces or backs, reducing human beings to property. In the Americas, European colonists copied the practice, burning letters of owners' names into flesh. For criminals, branding destroyed chances of reintegration. Even after serving punishment, the scar announced guilt forever. Branding turned human skin into a billboard of shame. It was more than pain. It was identity theft, stripping away personhood and replacing it with scars. Proof that cruelty doesn't always kill. Sometimes it just burns. Imagine being hung upside down, legs spread, while a saw tears through your body. That was the fate of countless criminals in medieval Europe and Asia. The saw execution wasn't just gruesome, it was theatre designed to horrify. The victim was tied by the ankles, hung head down. Gravity kept blood rushing to the brain, ensuring they stayed alive longer. Executioners began sawing between the legs, slicing through genitals, pelvis, and abdomen. Because of the position, victims didn't bleed out quickly. They remained conscious as the saw moved through their body. Chroniclers in 15th century France describe victims screaming until the blade reached the chest. Some lasted longer. The saw wasn't a specialized tool. Ordinary carpenters' saws were used, sometimes dulled to prolong agony. Crowds gathered in markets, cheering as blood rained down. In Spain and the Ottoman Empire, rebels and bandits met this fate. In Persia, Shahs ordered entire groups sawn in half for treason. The cruelty was symbolic. By starting between the legs, the execution erased masculinity, fertility, and dignity before killing. It wasn't just murder. It was humiliation carved into flesh. The saw was cheap, effective, and horrifying. No myths, no props. Just wood, steel, and the screams of men cut in half while still alive. Medieval justice was nothing if not resourceful. Medieval justice didn't always rely on evidence or testimony. Sometimes it relied on God. The trial by ordeal was a test where the accused faced fire, water, or iron to prove innocence. If you survived, God had spared you. If you died, well, you were guilty. There were many forms. In the ordeal of hot iron, the accused carried a red-hot bar for several paces. Their wounds were bandaged and after 3 days examined. If they healed cleanly, innocence. If they festered, guilt. In the ordeal of boiling water, the accused plunged an arm into a cauldron to retrieve a stone. Blisters were judged by priests days later. Innocence or guilt decided by infection. There was the ordeal of cold water. The accused was thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. Water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. Witch trials in later centuries leaned heavily on this logic. Women accused of sorcery were bound and tossed into lakes. Floating meant guilt. Sinking meant innocence in death. Trials by ordeal were common across Europe until the 13th century, when the church officially banned them. But by then, thousands had burned, boiled, or drowned, proving innocence. Trial by ordeal wasn't justice. It was roulette, played with fire and water. And in medieval Europe, God wasn't just worshipped. He was judge, jury, and executioner. We think of flogging as a punishment of whips, a few lashes across the back, something survivable. But in the Middle Ages, flogging could be more than discipline, it could be execution. Victims were beaten until their flesh hung loose, until bone showed, until the body itself gave up. Whips weren't simple cords. They were often leather straps tipped with knots, iron hooks, or sharp bone. Each strike tore skin open, spraying blood across the square. Executioners were trained to prolong suffering, spacing blows so victims stayed alive as long as possible. In monasteries, flogging was used for discipline. monks whipped until backs turned raw, but in cities it was spectacle. Criminals tied to whipping posts in marketplaces endured hundreds of lashes. Chroniclers in 14th century Paris describe thieves collapsing after their skin was wholly undone. Sometimes flogging was paired with exile. Survivors were driven out, their shredded bodies permanent warnings. Other times it was execution itself. In Russia, death by knout became infamous victims, flogged with heavy whips until ribs cracked and organs burst. The knout could kill in fewer than 50 lashes. The cruelty wasn't only physical, it was public. Crowds laughed and jeered, women fainted. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see flesh ripped from bone, and through it all, the condemned screamed until throats tore. Flogging wasn't discipline, it was destruction, one lash at a time. The myth of medieval justice is torture chambers filled with spikes. The truth is that sometimes a whip was enough to kill slowly, publicly, and mercilessly. When accused of witchcraft, you didn't just face fire. Before the flames came interrogation, and for that, executioners had chairs, not comfortable ones. The witch's chair was made of iron and covered in spikes. Sitting wasn't rest. It was agony. The chair was built from metal, every surface studded with sharp spikes, the seat, the backrest, the armrests, even the footrest. Victims were stripped and strapped down, their weight pressing spikes deep into flesh. Interrogators sometimes heated the chair red-hot before seating victims. Flesh sizzled, smoke rose, and screams echoed in stone chambers. Even without fire, hours on spikes left bodies punctured, bleeding, and unable to move without tearing wounds further. The goal wasn't to kill, at least not right away. It was to extract confessions, questions about pacts with the devil, flying at night, cursing cattle. Victims confessed anything, not because of guilt, but because of spikes driven into skin. Records from Germany and France in the 16th century describe women strapped for days, released only when they admitted sorcery. Some died from blood loss, others were dragged straight from the chair to the stake. The witch's chair was more than a tool, it was a stage. It turned interrogation into torture, silence into screams, and accusations into confessions, because in the Middle Ages, pain itself was proof. Medieval Europe had punishments for every crime. For women accused of gossiping, nagging, or witchcraft, one tool stood out: the ducking chair, a wooden seat on a long beam, used to dunk victims into rivers again and again until lungs filled with water. The chair was fixed at the end of a seesaw beam mounted on a dock. The accused was tied firmly, sometimes gagged, sometimes left to scream. Then the beam swung down, plunging her into cold water. Sometimes it was ritual humiliation, dunked a few times before being hauled up, soaked and shivering. But often it was more sinister. Repeated dunkings meant water inhalation, lungs filling, bodies thrashing. Death by drowning was common. Scolds, women accused of talking too much, faced the chair. So did those suspected of witchcraft. The idea was symbolic. If she floated, she was guilty. If she drowned, innocent. Either way, the punishment was cruelty disguised as justice. Crowds gathered on riverbanks, laughing as women gasped for breath. Children jeered, men shouted insults. Priests prayed loudly while victims struggled beneath water. Some victims fainted. Others never came up alive. The ducking chair shows how medieval society turned misogyny into spectacle. A woman's voice became a crime, her body a plaything for crowds, and water life itself became her executioner. You've heard of men being drawn and quartered, but sometimes it wasn't men doing the quartering, it was horses. Medieval Europe turned execution into spectacle by tying victims to 4 animals and driving them in opposite directions, tearing bodies limb from limb. The condemned was tied with ropes to wrists and ankles. 4 horses, trained or whipped, pulled away. At first, the body stretched grotesquely, joints popping from sockets, skin tore, muscles snapped, bones cracked. Sometimes it was quick limbs ripped off in a spray of blood. Other times, ropes held firm, forcing executioners to slice through half-torn flesh to finish the job. Chroniclers in 18th century France describe victims screaming as butchers cut the last strands holding limbs together. One of the most famous cases was Robert François Damien, who tried to assassinate King Louis XV in 1757. He was tied to 4 horses in Paris. For hours, the animals strained but couldn't rip him apart. Executioners used knives to finish the job, tearing his body into bloody pieces while crowds cheered. Earlier, in the Middle Ages, the punishment was used for traitors across Europe. Horses became tools of justice, their brute force weaponized by kings. Quartering by horses was more than execution. It was theater of cruelty, human flesh turned into a battlefield of muscle, blood, and animal strength. Proof that medieval rulers didn't just kill traitors, they destroyed them piece by piece. You fear the dentist today? Imagine dentistry in the Middle Ages, when pain relief didn't exist and tools were closer to blacksmith gear than surgical instruments. Tooth extraction wasn't just medical, it was punishment, torture, and sometimes entertainment. Dentists, or barbers, or executioners used iron pliers, hammers, and chisels. No anesthesia. Victims were strapped down, jaws pried open, and teeth yanked violently. Gums split, roots tore, blood poured. But beyond treatment, tooth pulling was a punishment. Debtors and thieves had teeth extracted publicly as reminders of dishonesty. Chroniclers in Germany describe whole rows of teeth ripped from criminals in markets. Victims screamed while crowds roared with laughter. Torturers loved teeth. Sensitive nerves meant unbearable agony. The Inquisition used tooth pulling to force confessions. Victims confessed instantly as pliers clamped and cracked. Sometimes teeth were broken in half, roots left festering, infection doing the killing later. Dentistry was also street entertainment. Tooth drawers set up in fairs, boasting of their skill. They yanked teeth before cheering crowds, waving bloody trophies in the air. Pain wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. Medieval dentistry proves cruelty didn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wore the mask of medicine, using teeth and nerves as pathways to agony. Next time you fear the dentist, remember, at least he doesn't carry iron pliers and a crowd hungry for screams. Imagine being forced to sit down, only to realize the seat is a sharpened wooden pyramid. Every second you shift, every breath you take, drives the point deeper into your body. That was the Judas cradle, a torture so obscene, victims often died without ever leaving the chair. The device looked simple, a tall wooden frame holding a pyramid-shaped spike. Victims were stripped naked and suspended above it with ropes. Slowly, they were lowered onto the point, which pierced the anus or vagina. It wasn't meant to kill instantly. Executioners adjusted ropes, lowering inch by inch, ensuring the spike entered slowly. Movement made it worse. The victim's own weight drove the point deeper, tearing flesh, rupturing organs. Sometimes victims were left for hours, sometimes days. Guards forced them to stay awake, preventing fainting. Starvation, exhaustion, infection, and agony combined until the body gave out. The humiliation was part of the punishment. Public displays were common. Crowds laughed as victims screamed, struggling not to shift on the spike. Priests preached sermons as flesh tore. Chroniclers describe confessions flowing easily under the threat of the cradle, women accused of witchcraft, men accused of sodomy, heretics who defied the church, all silenced by a pyramid of wood. The cruelty wasn't only physical. The cradle was designed to degrade nakedness, exposure, sexual violation. It was torture aimed at body and soul. The Judas cradle turned sitting into death. A pyramid, some rope, and patience that was enough to reduce strong men to screaming wrecks. Proof that medieval cruelty didn't need flames or blades, just gravity, wood, and humiliation. Death by blade was common. But what if the blade didn't kill? What if it peeled? One of the most horrifying medieval punishments was flaying alive, stripping the skin from the body while the victim still breathed. Executioners began with knives, slicing into the chest or back. Skin was pulled slowly, peeled away like parchment. Blood poured as nerves screamed. Victims often fainted, only to be revived with cold water so the process could continue. In the Assyrian Empire, centuries before the Middle Ages, flaying was recorded as punishment for rebels. The skin was nailed to city walls as warning. Medieval kings and lords revived the practice, especially for treason. One English record from the 14th century describes a sheriff flayed for corruption. his skin nailed to the door of his office. Chroniclers wrote that people touched the dried hide for decades after. In France, traitors were sometimes flayed in public squares. Crowds watched as strips of skin were pulled from thighs, arms, faces. Victims screamed until their voices failed. Death came from blood loss, shock, or infection. The cruelty wasn't just death, it was spectacle. Skin became trophy, nailed to walls or stretched like parchment. Rebels didn't just lose their lives, they lost their very covering, their humanity displayed as warning. Flaying alive proves cruelty wasn't just about killing, it was about stripping away identity, turning people into objects, and leaving skins as messages. The Iron Maiden is myth, flaying is fact. Some punishments didn't require fire, wheels, or blades. Sometimes, all it took was an iron collar and time. In medieval towns, criminals were chained in collars to walls or posts, left to starve, beg, and die under the eyes of their neighbors. The iron collar was thick, heavy, and locked tightly around the neck. Victims were chained upright to walls of town halls, bridges, or churches. They couldn't sit, couldn't lie down. Their entire weight pulled on their necks. Food was rarely given, water even less. Instead, passers-by spat, threw garbage, or beat the helpless prisoners. Some gave scraps, prolonging suffering. Others ignored them until they collapsed. The punishment could last days or weeks. Some victims died quickly from exposure. Others lingered, starving while children mocked them. Chroniclers in Germany described corpses left dangling in collars for weeks until birds picked at eyes. The cruelty was psychological. Unlike oubliettes, the collar wasn't hidden. It was public. Everyone saw your shame. Your body became a warning, your suffering entertainment. The iron collar turned the marketplace into a prison and starvation into spectacle. Proof that sometimes the cruelest tortures weren't complex machines, just iron, chains, and the indifference of a crowd. For nobles, executions weren't just punishments, they were entertainment, often paired with feasts. Across medieval courts, execution banquets turned death into dinner theatre, with guests eating while prisoners screamed. Chroniclers describe kings and dukes dining in halls while criminals were tortured outside. Windows opened so guests could watch between courses. Wine was poured, meat carved, and screams carried on the air. In 15th century Burgundy, Duke Philip reportedly hosted banquets where traitors were burned outside while musicians played. Nobles toasted as bodies twisted in flames. Sometimes victims were brought inside. In Italy, prisoners were strangled at noble banquets, collapsing onto floors while guests clapped. In France, rebels were flayed during feasts, their screams mingling with laughter. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was symbolic. By eating while others died, rulers showed absolute power, food and death mixed in ritual, nourishment for some, annihilation for others. Even commoners mimicked it. Markets sold food during public executions, vendors hawking bread while thieves swung from gallows. Death and dinner became inseparable. Execution banquets remind us that cruelty wasn't just punishment. It was performance, staged for audiences hungry for power and spectacle. In the Middle Ages, screams weren't interruptions, they were background music. If Drawn and Quartered was England's masterpiece of horror, another layer of cruelty often came before: castration. Treason wasn't just punished with death, it was punished with humiliation, mutilation, and erasure of manhood. The condemned was dragged through the streets, jeered at by crowds. Then, before execution, castration was performed. Genitals hacked off and thrown into fire, often while the victim still lived. Only then came hanging partial, to the brink of death, then disembowelment, entrails ripped out and burned, finally quartering. The symbolism was clear. Treason wasn't just betrayal, it was emasculation, dishonor written on the body. Castration destroyed not just life, but lineage. No heirs, no legacy, only shame. William Wallace, Thomas Armstrong, and countless others endured this fate. Chroniclers record screams carrying across squares as genitals burned, executioners grinning. Crowds didn't recoil, they cheered. The more brutal the punishment, the more secure the crown. Treason in medieval England wasn't just punished. It was annihilated, body, pride, and bloodline destroyed, proof that in the Middle Ages, cruelty was law and mercy a myth. In medieval Europe, words could kill you. If you cursed God, insulted the church, or mocked a saint, punishment wasn't a fine, it was mutilation. The tools? Red-hot irons and sharp blades. Blasphemy meant losing the very organ that spoke it, your tongue. The ritual was cruelly precise. The condemned was bound in public squares. Priests stood by, reading out the blasphemy. Then blacksmiths heated iron tongs until they glowed red. The victim's mouth was forced open. Tongues were clamped, seared, or sliced out entirely. The pain was unimaginable. Flesh hissed, smoke rose, screams choked into gurgles. Sometimes, only part of the tongue was burned, leaving the victim stammering for life. Other times, tongues were ripped out by the root, bleeding profusely. Infection often killed them later. It wasn't just about silencing, it was symbolic. The tongue that insulted God was destroyed. In Germany, chroniclers recorded entire groups punished this way during heresy scares. In France, poets accused of mocking the king lost tongues before crowds. The humiliation was permanent. Survivors were left unable to speak clearly, marked for life as blasphemers. Some wore iron collars with bells to announce their shame. Hot irons and tongue removal show how fragile freedom was in the Middle Ages. A word too many, a joke too bold, and your voice could be silenced forever, not by censorship, but by fire and steel. Today we think of the Wheel of Fortune as a game show, a chance to win prizes. But in the Middle Ages, Fortune's wheel meant death. A literal wheel spun to decide how, or even if, you would die. In some German towns, criminals faced execution by lot. A wheel marked with punishments hanging, flogging, beheading, even mercy was spun in front of crowds. Fate decided. But sometimes the wheel wasn't chance, it was the breaking wheel itself, spun slowly while the condemned was tied on. Executioners struck as the wheel turned, smashing bones in rhythm. Crowds watched each crack, each scream, waiting to see if death would come quickly or slowly. The randomness terrified people. It suggested divine judgment, God's hand guiding the spin. Priests blessed wheels before trials. If the wheel stopped on torture, victims were told it was heaven's will. Records from 15th century Augsburg describe thieves trembling as wheels spun, their fate sealed by wooden boards and iron nails. Some prayed for quick death, others fainted before the spin ended. The medieval Wheel of Fortune wasn't prizes and confetti, it was bones snapping, crowds roaring, and priests declaring, God has chosen. Proof that chance itself can be turned into cruelty. Forget dungeons. Some criminals weren't locked underground. They were locked above ground in iron cages, hung from city walls, left to die slowly as wind, weather, and birds tore them apart. The cages were human-shaped, built of iron bars, sometimes spiked inside. Victims were stuffed in, arms and legs contorted, then hoisted high. They couldn't sit, they couldn't lie down. They could barely breathe. Days passed. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, sun-blistered skin, cold nights froze bones. Worst of all were the birds. Crows and ravens circled, pecking at eyes, lips, fingers. Sometimes death came in days, other times weeks. Skeletons often remained in cages long after flesh was gone, grim decorations on castle walls. In Lübeck and Ghent, cages still hang where men once starved, their bones rattling until wind scattered them. The cruelty was deliberate. It wasn't just execution, it was display. Bodies in cages showed all who entered the city what happened to rebels, thieves, and pirates. Cages weren't prisons. They were coffins hung in the sky, where death was slow and public, and carrion birds finished what the law began. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't healing, it was guesswork mixed with cruelty. The most infamous therapy? Bloodletting. Doctors drained patients of blood to balance humors, but often they drained them to death. The theory was simple. Illness came from imbalance. Too much blood, cut a vein. Too much bile, purge it. Doctors used knives, leeches, or glass cups heated to draw blood. Patients grew pale, fainted, sometimes died. But physicians insisted the cure worked if the patient survived. If not, the illness was blamed. Kings weren't safe. England's Charles II was treated with massive bloodletting during his final illness in 1685. He lost pints of blood in days, collapsing before doctors' eyes. His cure killed him. Ordinary people fared worse. Surgeons drained fever patients, plague victims, even pregnant women. In some towns, barbers doubled as bloodletters, cutting customers before shaving them. The cruelty wasn't intentional, but it was real. Thousands died not from disease, but from treatments that bled life away. Medieval medicine shows cruelty doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from ignorance. Bloodletting didn't heal, it just turned patients into victims of their own doctors. Today, diplomacy means letters, treaties, and summits. In the Middle Ages, it often meant body parts. Kings and lords sent severed heads, hands, and limbs as messages, macabre parcels proving power. When rebels were executed, their heads were displayed on spikes, but they were also shipped. King Edward I of England sent the severed head of William Wallace to London Bridge and his limbs to 4 towns across Britain. Each limb was a political statement: resist, and this will be you. In France, rebels' hands were cut off and mailed to villages. In the Ottoman Empire, defeated enemies' heads were stacked and delivered to sultans in baskets. Chroniclers describe towers of skulls in Serbia, built from thousands of heads. Even allies weren't spared. Betrayers often received gifts of body parts as warnings. Diplomacy wasn't letters sealed with wax, it was flesh sealed with blood. The cruelty was effective. Messages written in gore didn't need translation. Every farmer, every soldier, every noble understood exactly what was meant. Dismemberment as diplomacy proves the medieval world didn't just trade goods, it traded fear. And in an age of cruelty, nothing spoke louder than a severed head delivered to your door.